Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we revealed the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. Most corrupt Holman Prison, Alabama. In Alabama, there is a prison so infamous that even the state stopped pretending it was under control. A prison where guards were arrested, where executions happened down the hall from gang stabbings, where corruption wasn't an exception. It was the operating system. This isn't a story about bad inmates. It's a story about state power without accountability, about what happens when violence, neglect, and authority collide behind walls no one is allowed to see. This is William C. Holman Correctional Facility. And what happened here didn't just break prisoners. It exposed a system that stopped caring whether it was legal, as long as it was quiet. Alabama's most feared PR. ISIN. Holman Prison isn't just another maximum security facility. It holds Alabama's death row, its execution chamber, and some of the most violent, desperate conditions in the state. Built in the 1970s, Holman was supposed to represent control. Instead, it became a symbol of collapse, overcrowding, understaffing, a culture of fear on both sides of the bars. Guards referred to certain cell blocks as war zones. Inmates called it something worse, a place where the state stopped pretending. And the deeper you go into Holman's history, the clearer it becomes. This prison wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as allowed. Where the state takes life, Holman isn't just violent. It's final. For decades, this prison housed Alabama's execution chamber. Men were escorted past cells filled with screaming, laughter, and chaos to a room designed for silence. Executions happened in the same institution where guards were assaulted regularly. Inmates controlled cell blocks. Medical care barely existed. That contradiction matters, because when the state claims the authority to kill, it also claims responsibility for everything else inside those walls. At Holman, that responsibility collapsed. And the people who paid the price weren't just the condemned. They everyone. A prison run by shortage. Holman was never adequately staffed. On some nights, one guard controlled entire housing units. Backup was slow. Equipment was outdated. Training was minimal. Guards were paid less than neighboring states, while facing far more danger. And inmates noticed. When staffing collapses, power doesn't disappear. It shifts. Gangs filled the vacuum. Contraband became currency. Violence became policy. Holman didn't descend into chaos overnight. It was starved into it. But the most disturbing part of Holman's story isn't the violence everyone expects. It's the corruption no one talks about. Guards for sale at Holman. At Holman, corruption didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in, quiet, normalized, almost expected. In a prison where guards were outnumbered, underpaid, and overwhelmed, inmates learned quickly. The easiest way to survive wasn't violence. It was leverage. Guards controlled movement, searches, doors, blind spots. And some guards, exhausted, broke, or bitter, began trading control for cash. Phones came in first, then drugs, then weapons. One former officer later admitted, "You could make more in 1 week inside than a month on the job." Once guards started selling access, the prison changed. Because now, rules weren't said. They were negotiated. Gone. GS, knives, and control. When control slips in a prison, gangs don't riot. They organize. At Holman, gangs filled the vacuum left by staff shortages and corruption. They controlled contraband flow, protection, discipline, debt collection. Weapons were everywhere. Not guns, but blades. Shanks made from bed frames. Razors melted into toothbrushes. metal sharpened against concrete floors. Guards knew. Everyone knew. But searches were inconsistent. Lockdowns were rare. And removing weapons meant confronting power the state no longer fully held. Violence became predictable, and therefore acceptable. Death row beside chaos. Here's what made Holman unique and deeply disturbing. Death row existed inside the same collapsing institution. Men awaiting execution could hear fights, stabbings, screams at night. The state claimed precision and legality in executions, while chaos ruled just feet away. That contradiction mattered, because it revealed something uncomfortable. The system could be meticulous when it wanted to be. It just chose not to be most of the time. One death row inmate said, "They were organized enough to kill us, but not enough to keep us safe." That wasn't a failure of resources. It was a failure of priorities. And while violence stayed inside the walls, something else was spilling out. Drugs. Lots of them. And everyone knew exactly how they were getting in. The drugs that flooded the prison. Drugs didn't sneak into Holman. They arrived on schedule. Synthetic marijuana, methamphetamine, prescription pills traded like currency. They came through guard pockets, food carts, maintenance access. Sometimes they were thrown over fences, but rarely. The real pipeline wore a badge. Drugs did more than numb inmates. They destabilized the prison. Overdoses increased. Deaths turned violent. Mental health crises exploded. When inmates collapsed, medical response was slow, sometimes non-existent. Incident reports described overdoses as medical events. No questions asked. No investigations launched. Because tracing drugs meant tracing guards. And no one wanted to follow that line too far. Sexual abuse and silence. In any prison, sexual abuse is about power. At Holman, power was unchecked. Inmates reported guards demanding sexual acts in exchange for protection, phones, basic safety. Male inmates, female guards, male guards. The abuse crossed lines the system refused to name. Complaints disappeared. Victims were transferred or punished. And reporting carried risk. One inmate said, "If you spoke up, you didn't last long." Silence wasn't just encouraged. It was enforced. Because acknowledging sexual abuse meant admitting loss of control. And Holman's administration wasn't prepared to do that. Inmate murders the state ignored. Men died at Holman regularly. Stabbings during lockdowns. Beatings in blind spots. Killings over drug debts and gang disputes. Some deaths made the news. Most didn't. Official statements used familiar language. Altercation between inmates. Isolated incident. No ongoing threat. Families were notified late. Details were scarce. Autopsies took months. And accountability? Almost non-existent. One former staff member admitted, if it didn't involve a guard, it wasn't a priority. Holman didn't just fail to prevent violence. It learned how to absorb it quietly. But eventually, the silence cracked. Not because the state acted, but because someone inside decided they had no thing left to lose. Whistleblowers who were punished. Holman didn't lack people who knew what was happening. It lacked protection for anyone who spoke up. Guards reported missing keys. Inmates with phones no one searched. Blind spots that never got fixed. The response was predictable. Schedules changed. Overtime vanished. Dangerous posts assigned alone. Some officers were labeled not team players. Others were quietly pushed out. One former guard said, "You didn't get fired. You got set up to quit." Inmates who filed grievances fared even worse. Cells searched repeatedly. Property destroyed. Transfers to hostile units. Whistleblowing at Holman wasn't heroic. It was hazardous. And that's how corruption survived. Not by secrecy, but by punishment. Federal lawsuits and DOJ attention. When internal systems fail, pressure moves outward. Families sued. Former inmates testified. Advocacy groups compiled evidence. Civil rights lawsuits alleged. Unconstitutional levels of violence. Extreme understaffing. Deliberate indifference to medical needs. Groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and others pushed the issue into federal court. Eventually, the U.S. Department of Justice took notice. Investigators examined staffing logs, incident reports, medical records. Their findings echoed what insiders already knew. Holman wasn't just dangerous. It was structurally incapable of keeping people safe. That mattered, because once the federal government questions a prison, the state can't claim ignorance enim. Or the execution boycott. T.S. Holman's most public role, executions, became its biggest embarrassment. Execution teams struggled to carry out lethal injections. Medical staff refused to participate. Drugs couldn't be obtained. Procedures failed. Executions were delayed, postponed, canceled. Lawyers argued that the same prison unable to prevent stabbings and overdoses had no business carrying out executions. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. A prison that couldn't guarantee basic safety claimed the authority to end life. Public scrutiny intensified, and for the first time in decades, Holman was being questioned not just as a prison, but as a symbol of unchecked state power. But lawsuits and investigations didn't shut Holman down. They didn't fix staffing. They didn't stop the violence, because the state had already made a choice. And that choice was to endure, not reform. Medical neglect as policy. At Holman, medical care wasn't denied outright. It was delayed. And in prison, delay can be a death sentence. Inmates reported waiting weeks, sometimes months, for basic treatment. Chronic illnesses went unmanaged. Mental health care was reduced to pills slid through a slot. Emergencies were handled with skepticism. Chest pain became anxiety. Seizures became acting out. Psychological breakdowns became disciplinary problems. Staff shortages made it worse. Nurses covered multiple units. Doctors rotated in briefly, then disappeared. Medical records were incomplete, outdated, or missing entirely. One former inmate said, "You didn't go to medical to get help. You went to get documented if you survived long enough." This wasn't accidental. Federal filings later described a pattern of deliberate indifference, a legal phrase that means the state knew harm was happening. They allowed it anyway. The guards, who went to prison. Eventually, corruption at Holman became too visible to ignore. Guards were arrested for smuggling drugs, bringing in phones, aiding gang activity, assault and abuse. Some pled guilty quietly. Others fought charges in court. What shocked many wasn't that guards were corrupt. It was how predictable the corruption looked. Low pay, mandatory overtime, minimal oversight. The same conditions that existed for years. One former guard-turned-defendant told the court, they knew what was happening. They just didn't care until it embarrassed them. Some guards were sentenced to prison time. A few entered facilities not unlike Holman itself. This time, without keys, without authority, without protection. The system didn't reflect. It simply replaced them. Bama's culture of impunity. Holman didn't exist in isolation. It reflected a broader culture. A culture where prisons were hidden from public view. Where lawsuits were settled without admission. Where leadership changed, but practices didn't. State officials responded to criticism with familiar language. Challenging environment. Limited resources. Dedicated staff. Rarely did they acknowledge systemic failure. And almost never did they accept responsibility. Independent oversight was weak. Internal investigations lacked teeth. Reforms were announced, then quietly abandoned. Holman survived scandal after scandal because it served a purpose. It absorbed society's most uncomfortable problems and kept them out of sight. In that sense, it worked. But the cost was human. By now, the evidence was overwhelming. The violence, the neglect, the corruption. And yet, Holman was still open, still operating, still breaking people. So, the question became unavoidable. Why? Riot conditions without riots. People imagine prison collapse as chaos. Riots, fires, mass uprisings. Holman never needed riots. It lived in a permanent state of pre-riot. Conditions were so volatile that everyone, staff and inmates, knew a single spark could end everything. So the prison adapted, not by improving safety, but by suppressing movement. Extended lockdowns became routine. Meals were delivered to cells for days at a time. Showers were canceled. Programs eliminated. This wasn't discipline. It was containment. One guard described it like this: "We weren't preventing violence. We were postponing it." And postponement became policy. A prison can survive like that if are years. But it doesn't function. It decays. Families who never got answers. For families, Holman was a black box. Loved ones called and got no response. Letters went unanswered. Visits were canceled without explanation. When inmates were injured or killed, families were often notified late. Details were scarce, sometimes wrong. Mothers learned their sons were dead through news reports. Siblings were told incidents were under investigation forever. One family member said, "It felt like they were waiting for us to give up asking." And many did, because fighting the state from the outside is exhausting, especially when the state doesn't have to answer. Holman didn't just isolate inmates. It isolated grief. Why Holman still exists. By every measurable standard, Holman failed. Violence remained high. Staffing stayed dangerously low. Federal scrutiny never fully disappeared. And yet, the prison stayed open. Why? Because Holman serves a function beyond incarceration. It houses death row. It centralizes high-risk inmates. It concentrates problems, so other facilities don't have to. Closing it would force the state to confront overcrowding elsewhere, underfunding across the system. The true cost of incarceration. Holman isn't maintained because it works. It's maintained because replacing it would require change. And change is expensive. Politically, financially, morally. So the prison endures, not as a success, but as a container for failure. At this point, the question is no longer whether Holman is broken. It's what Holman reveals. About power. About responsibility. About what the state is willing to tolerate in our name. What Holman reveals about state power. Holman Prison isn't an accident. It's a consequence. A consequence of how state power operates when it's hidden from view. Inside Holman, the state exercised its most extreme authorities at the same time. The power to confine, the power to neglect, and the power to kill. All within the same collapsing institution. That combination matters. Because when the state claims the right to take life, it also claims moral authority. At Holman, that authority eroded. Not through one scandal, but through years of tolerated failure. Understaffing wasn't a surprise. Violence wasn't unpredictable. Medical neglect wasn't unknown. These were documented realities. And yet, budgets passed. Leaders rotated. The prison remained open. This is how institutional failure becomes normalized. Not by denial, but by endurance. Holman shows us that state power doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like inaction. The choice not to fix what is clearly broken. The system that learned not. After the lawsuits, after the investigations, after the deaths, Holman remained. Some policies changed on paper. Some leaders moved on. Some guards were arrested. But the system itself? It absorbed the damage and kept going. Because systems don't learn unless they're forced to. And nothing forced change. There was no reckoning. No comprehensive reform. No moment where the state admitted the truth. That Holman failed, not because it was unique, but because it was representative. Representative of what happens when incarceration becomes a warehouse. when punishment replaces responsibility, when silence is cheaper than reform. Holman didn't collapse loudly. It decayed quietly. And that's what makes it dangerous. What Holman leaves behind. Holman Prison still stands. Concrete, steel, unmoved. But the question it leaves behind doesn't belong to Alabama alone. It belongs to every system that believes control is enough, every institution that mistakes endurance for success, and every society willing to look away as long as the suffering stays out of sight. Holman isn't just a prison. It's proof that when power goes unchecked, failure doesn't look like collapse. It looks like business as usual. Long pause. And that may be the most dangerous thing of all. This wasn't a secret. It was tolerated. If this story made you uncomfortable, it should. Because places like Holman don't exist by accident. They exist by permission. The M.N. who left Holman. When inmates left Holman, they didn't leave it behind. They carried it. Men transferred to other facilities arrived with reputations already written for them. High risk. Violent. Problem inmate. Some had survived years in a prison where violence was normal, where medical neglect was expected, where trust didn't exist. Dropped into new facilities, many struggled to adjust. Not because they were dangerous, but because they had been trained to survive chaos. One former Holman inmate said, "Other prisons felt fake, like the rules might matter, until they didn't." Holman didn't just damage the men inside it. It exported that damage. The guards who walked away. Not all consequences came with handcuffs. Some guards simply left. They resigned quietly, transferred to other careers, or walked away from corrections entirely. Many carried guilt, not always for specific acts, but for staying, for adapting, for surviving by shutting down. Former officers described nightmares, hypervigilance, an inability to relax in silence. One guard admitted, "I thought I left Holman, but it followed me home." The system didn't offer counseling, didn't offer accountability. It offered replacement, hires, and the cycle continued. Next generation of failure. After scandals fade, institutions reset their image. New training programs were announced. Oversight committees formed. Language softened. But conditions stayed the same. Low pay, mandatory overtime, understaffed units. And new guards entered the system believing, this time will be different. Until it wasn't. Because corruption doesn't need the same people. It only needs the same pressures. Holman wasn't unique. It was predictable. Why the public never saw it coming. Most people never saw Holman clearly. Because prison stories are hard to sell. They're slow, complicated, uncomfortable. There are no heroes. Just systems grinding people down. Media coverage focused on moments. A riot, an execution, an arrest. Not the years of decay in between. And that's how institutions scrutiny. They attention. The quiet agreement. Holman existed because of an unspoken agreement between lawmakers, administrators, and the public. As long as the violence stayed contained, as long as the suffering stayed invisible, the system could continue. No one needed to say it out loud. That was the agreement. And it until people start deep paying attention. The dangerous lie. The most dangerous lie about Holman is this. That it was broken. Broken things can be fixed. Holman wasn't broken. It was tolerated. Every warning sign was visible. Every failure documented. Every tragedy predictable. The system didn't malfunction. It operated within acceptable limits. And that's the truth no ends. Tuition once exposed. What happens next? Holman's story isn't over. Because the conditions that created it still exist. Somewhere right now, another prison is slipping into the same pattern. Understaffed, ignored, normalized. And one day, it will have a name too. The real question isn't whether Holman was the worst. It's how many more places like it we're willing to allow. Before we admit this was never about one prison. It was about what we chose to accept. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and stay locked in. Until next time, keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp. Remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.